Count? Indeed.
Anyone who calls themselves a horror fan has at least heard the name Nosferatu, even if they haven't seen it. But here's the thing, did you know that this 1920s film is more like a vampire than you might think? Just like the undead supernatural entity, this film literally resurrects itself after what can be called a bloodbath of a legal feud. That's right folks, today we're gonna dive deep into the Nosferatu vs. Dracula legal feud that many of you might not know about. So grab your garlic, grab your crucifix, and lock the doors. It's about to get spooky. Before we get into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin.
Obey.
Dracula and its creation. When it comes to Gothic literature, Bram Stoker's Dracula is literally at the top of the list. It's one of those Gothic horror novels that you have to read if you want to experience surrealism, creativity, and the fascinating lore of what we know as vampires. I mean, think about it. Vampires in literature are so common today. We have Twilight, we have Vampire Diaries, and so much more. But all of this began with the one Irish author who came up with the idea from scratch back in 1897. Now, of course, like most pieces of art, people in the Victorian era didn't quite find Stoker's Dracula that interesting when it came out. But now, oh boy, it's a classic. It's a cult favorite. This book started off the whole vampire supernatural romance fantasy that we have, and it did so well. The main plotline is pretty simple. We have Dracula, the main antagonist and central character of the book, who travels to England all the way from Transylvania because of his selfish desires. He wanted more blood to feast on and more people to spread his curse to, but what he wasn't expecting was to come across a group of men and one woman who were ready to battle it out with him and stop him. Now, I know on the surface, this plot seems pretty basic, but the way Stoker wrote about the characters is just chef's kiss. He could have written the whole book from a third-person perspective. He could have given us bland characters who just go about their way, making mistakes and becoming Dracula's snack. And then eventually, by some deus ex machina, they save themselves in the whole of England. But Stoker did none of that. He created characters who are intelligent and curious, and even intuitive to a degree. They're not a band of people who just came together because of circumstances. No, they're all well throughout. We have Van Helsing, the doctor of supernatural practices who believes deeply in the mysterious ways the world works. And to counteract him, we have Dr. Seward, who's a psychologist. He's someone who needs to see logic at every step, fighting and even pushing against Helsing's ideas and opinions to make better sense of things. We have Mina Harker, this extremely well-educated woman who's a little headstrong but extremely self-reliant. She's a married woman with responsibilities that shape her into the person we see in front of us. This is not a bad thing at all, which is why when she succumbs to Dracula and his killer charms, we feel bad for her. Parallelly, we have Lucy Westerna. She's a little younger than Mina, much less stoic, but she's very progressive for her time, and that naivete and intelligence are what makes her such an easy victim for Dracula. The book starts with Jonathan Harker's journal entries, forcing us to be in the middle of his thoughts, allowing us to truly feel his worry, his prejudices, and his ruminations. The book continues this by giving us different letters, documents, newspaper articles, and other journal entries in each following chapter, forcing us to look at the same situation from different angles, different viewpoints. This type of approach would have been a massacre, but no, Stoker did that so well. The novel is an extremely cerebral piece of work, making you understand the dread that everyone feels, because truly, isn't that what Dracula is? He's the embodiment of death, whether you like it or not. Yes, he is devilishly handsome. Yes, he has that sex appeal, that oomph, but in the end, if you mingle with him, you're not coming out of that date alive. The themes of finite knowledge and life of our human heroes are palpable. The vampire with a greater knowledge base is a huge threat, because not only do you have to outsmart someone who knows more than you do, but you also have to do it while they're trying their best to murder you and your close ones. The stakes are high, and the thrill is even higher. What started off as a simple real estate business meeting ended up spiraling out of control, and Harker had no choice but to deal with the cards he was dealt with, while navigating his prejudices to save himself. Now, we all know that Dracula is a work of fiction, but that doesn't change the fact that this story serves as a text that you can use to teach people about human nature. Darkness in humans is inherent. The balance between good and bad, right and wrong, is always there, and Stoker used his work to hold up the darker parts of human nature in this tale of mythic vampires. I mean, look at Elizabeth Bathory from the 16th and 17th century. She killed hundreds of young women simply because she wished to be immortal. She's not an actual monster with fangs, scales, and pointy teeth, but can you really look at her blood-soaked hands and call her any less than that? We as humans are one careless step away from spiraling and becoming the monsters we abhor. Stoker's work reminds us of who we are as humans and what we stand for over and over again. He also plays off the Christian zeitgeist of the Victorian Victorian era in his book, making it a tug-of-war between good and evil, drawing parallels between the devil and Dracula himself. The book is a piece of literature with exploration and transcendentalism. So, this transcendentalism is a philosophy that was ushered in during the mid-19th century, and talks about how an individual's own intuition actually creates the physical and empirical, even if it goes against the existing norms. Transcendentalism is what led to so many changes, like communal living, better conditions for workers, and suffrage for women. Throughout the book, these new ideas and new thoughts are present. A small example of this in the book would be when Mina berates herself for crying twice in one day. In those times, expressing emotions was seen as childish. But if you're not experiencing the emotions, how are you in touch with who you are? How do you truly know who you are? So this constriction of emotions ended up making people pent up and close-minded. When Mina fell ill, she refused to talk about it simply because she didn't wish to be a bother. If she had talked about it and had a support system for her, then it wouldn't have been so easy for Dracula to seduce her the way he did. She drank blood from his bosom, which, other than being blatantly erotic, also showcases how much Mina craved to get out of the mold she was put in by societal expectations of her. She was open to being hypnotized and seduced because she was starving for something more magical, more carnal. As you finish the book, you realize that the only reason Dracula's attack was thwarted was because this group of people chose to actually believe instead of brushing aside the supernatural things happening around them. If they had not believed in those things, despite them happening in front of their eyes, then Dracula would have been able to carry on with his attack without worry, because people would never have believed that he even existed in the first place. Bram Stoker's work is so much more than just a spook fest, and if you haven't read it, you definitely should. But now the question is, how are Nosferatu and Dracula even related? Good question. Let's discuss that. Nosferatu and the Unauthorized Adaptation. It was the 4th of March, 1922, and the Berlin Zoological Garden was the venue. The marble hall of the garden stood witness to the most crucial moment in horror movie history, with the first ever airing of Nosferatu, a symphony of horror. Upon arrival, he meets with this tall man in black, and despite the evident red flags, the clerk stays. The longer he stays, the more he realizes that his host is not the most normal of the bunch. Sure enough, turns out his host loves taking day-long naps in a coffin under the castle, and loves lurking in the shadows at night, while sipping on some forbidden Kool-Aid coming from juice boxes, which are other humans. This film was the first time that a lot of people saw a vampire on the screen, and oh boy did it leave a mark. Who can forget the way Count Orlok's shadow creeps up on a wall, or the way he reacts whenever he's in the sun? But here's the thing, Nosferatu is a very blatant ripoff of Dracula. Albin Grau, the producer of this film, was a part of the troops in World War I. He was sent to the Serbian front lines during his deployments. There, on meeting with local people, he learned about this blood-sucking monstrosity that lurks in the countryside. In fact, one of the farmers even claimed to be the son of a vampire. Now, the idea that there are vampires out there as myths or legends, and they're believed to the point that an adult man believes his father to be a vampire, was fascinating to Grau. Grau decided that once he was back in Germany, he would work on a project surrounding vampires. While the time with the Serbian locals did serve as an inspiration, you cannot really make a movie out of that now, can you? I mean, technically you could, but why would you when you already have a popular piece of literature that has all the charm, charisma, and danger you need for the movie? So he decided that he wanted to use Bram Stoker's Dracula as the basic skeleton for his story. Grau got Enrico Diekman, another producer, on board, and created Prana Films in 1921. This was going to be their very own production house, and they were going to make a masterpiece. After creating Prana Films, Grau hired Henrik Galeen and F.W. Murnau as the writer and director, respectively. With the entire behind-the-scenes group ready, the work was ready to begin, except for one small itty-bitty detail they forgot: getting permission from Stoker to create it. Now, Stoker had been dead for about a decade by now. His work was in the public domain in the US, but not in Germany, and it wouldn't be for the next 50 years at least. On top of that, the rights to the book were with Florence Balcom Stoker, Bram Stoker's widow. Whether or not Grau and the others tried to get the signature, or Florence Stoker refused, is unknown, but the rights were not handed over. So now, Grau and his gang had two choices. Either A, they go to America to make the movie, or B, they wait until the book reaches the public domain in Germany and then make the film. But why wait for some 50 years when the present is just as tempting, right? So Grau and his group decided they were gonna go ahead with it anyway, and hope that no one would care. To bypass the blatant ripoff, they tweaked a few things here and there in Nosferatu. Instead of being set in Britain, the story was now set in Germany. Mina and Jonathan Harker became Ellen and Thomas Hutter. There is no Lucy in the story, and Ellen, who occasionally sleepwalks, ends up becoming the victim instead. Oh, and of course, Count Dracula is now Count Orlok. We get a different backstory for the vampires too, with Orlok being created by the lieutenant demon of Satan, known as Belial, instead instead of being a warlord who came home from a war as a vampire. Grau and Murnau both wanted to create a demonic lineage for Orlok, and they did so by creating the whole Belial backstory. The main plot, however, remained pretty similar for both. Now, the premiere of the movie went really well, like exceptionally well. German critics complimented the movie left and right, specifically the visuals and the creepy atmosphere. The Prana Films team assumed they had gotten away with the blatant thievery. However, as ironic as it may be, the movie did not actually do that well for the general public. Prana Films spent an obscene amount of money to promote the film, but it didn't do a thing. The ticket sales were underwhelming, and it seemed like it was time to say goodbye to the company as a whole. Just when they thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. The final boss entered the game, Florence Balcom Stoker.
Die with all those lives on my conscience! All that blood on my hands!
The legal battle, Nosferatu versus Dracula. When Nosferatu came out, Florence was about 60 years old. She had no idea that a movie was created using her late husband's work, until one morning she was sent a letter. The letter didn't state much. It simply contained a flyer of the movie with very clear writing of freely adapted from Bram Stoker's Dracula. Florence had been working as the literary executor of Stoker's works for a while by this time. The royalties that she received from the book sales were a huge part of her income, and she was not willing to let anyone simply fly by and mooch pennies off of her. Stoker had already registered his work in the London Copyright back in 1897, so Florence had valid grounds to sue. Now, you might think money would be a problem given she was just a widow. Well, thanks to Stoker's position and impactful work, the British Incorporated Society of Authors decided to come in clutch and helped her out with a lawyer. So with all the nitty-gritty sorted, it was time for Florence to bring down the hammer on Prana Films, and that's exactly what she did. The shooting script of the movie describes it as something based on the novel, and the German intertitles acknowledge Stoker's work as the main source of inspiration, so suing the film was as easy as taking candy from a baby. Now, Prana Films was already broke from the lack of box office success, as I've mentioned, so they filed for bankruptcy. Florence still went on with her case, and in 1924 she won. But there was no money to be had, and Florence was absolutely not okay with that, so she decided to change her trajectory. She wanted to make sure no one ever saw the movie and went to the judge again, this time asking to be the rightful owner of the film so that she could have every copy destroyed. The judges acted swiftly in her favor, and soon enough, government agents went all around Germany, scouring and burning all the copies of the film that they could get their hands on. Florence went out of her way to inform anyone who wanted to screen the movie that she was now the owner and did not wish for it to be screened. With the way the movie was being destroyed, everyone assumed Nosferatu would have joined all the other lost silent films from that era. However, somehow, some copies of Nosferatu managed to survive. One of these copies ended up in the US, where Dracula was a part of the public domain due to a copyright error. The film had copies made, which were shared amongst American horror fans, and well, news eventually reached Florence again. As you can imagine, Florence was not too happy with the news, but it was not like she could have done anything about it, so she focused her efforts on everything she could do to round up all the copies in Europe and destroy them. But by this time, Florence knew that she was fighting a losing war. Nosferatu was reaching cult status, and there was no way that she could curb that all the way from England. So once again, she changed her trajectory. Instead of going after the film itself, she decided she would create something that was better in a way. Universal Studios approached her with $40,000, which is roughly around $584,000 now, and bought the screen rights. This resulted in the film that came out in 1931, with Bela Lugosi playing the titular Dracula with his cape. While yes, the movie was a big hit, and this pushed Universal to continue making more monster movies down the line, it failed at giving Florence the one thing she had been chasing after. Dracula could not wipe away Nosferatu for good. The legacy of the feud. While there's no denying that Count Orlok is a copy of Dracula, they're so vastly different that you have to look at them as two separate entities. On the one hand, we have the savvy, suave, sophisticated Count Dracula with his charming smile, sharp teeth, and pointed nails. While he may have a pallid complexion that borders on severe anemia, he is otherwise just a normal man. Or so Jonathan thinks when he first meets the Count. On the other hand, we have Count Orlok, played by Max Schreck, who's absolutely harrowing. Bat-like ears, rat-like teeth, and claw-like fingers are all external features that, when coupled with his awkward and strange behavior, give us a terrifying character who will surely haunt everyone's nightmares. Unlike Dracula, who can hide his scheming nature with his charming smile, something Bela Lugosi embodied perfectly, we have Orlok, who's completely overrun by his animalistic tendencies, desires, and hunger. When it came to Dracula, we had Van Helsing laying out the strengths and weaknesses for us, which definitely made it easy to figure out ways to defeat him. When it comes to Orlok, we know nothing of that sort. We're given given the implication that maybe not inviting him would work, but then again, he does not come through the window Ellen opened for him and takes the stairs instead, so we just don't know what his exact weaknesses are, except the sunlight. The biggest difference between Orlok and Dracula, in my eyes, has to be the effects of their bite. If Dracula bites someone, that person becomes a vampire, whereas when Orlok bites someone, that person is dead. The viciousness, maliciousness, and general brutal nature of who Orlok happens to be is truly bone-chilling, which I believe has played a huge role in how we see these two characters today. Over the years, the fandom for vampires has grown significantly, and yet the tropes of all the vampires have remained the same. Orlok was the first vampire who was shown to have a tremendous weakness in the sunlight, something we all believe in even to this day. The sensationalized Hollywood depiction of Dracula is definitely a masterpiece, there's no doubt about it. With Bela Lugosi in the movie, how can you expect it to be bad? But that doesn't change the fact that Nosferatu is a whole different ballgame. This silent movie was a ripoff, an intellectual property theft if you want to put it that way, but this movie is a masterpiece. It's a cult classic for the dread it portrays in every scene, as our characters figure out how to outsmart this feral monster who's been killing anyone who stands in his path. The film would not have survived had it not been for film collectors and film lovers who went above and beyond to protect it from an angry English widow and Nazi officers. And yet, here we are, with Nosferatu rising from the dead, much like the vampire it spins the tale about. The happy ending of the feud was, as Dar Stoker aptly put it, Florence Stoker got her money and her stage rights, and Nosferatu still remained. The ability to know what is right and what is wrong is definitely important, and Florence's actions did set the curb for all the authors, musicians, and artists who followed her and stood up against intellectual property theft. But then again, I also understand the sentiments other film lovers share, which is that Florence's attempt to eradicate a masterpiece from cinema history over copyright claims was an act of vandalism. This feud, while brutal and gritty, did set the curb on how any movie adaptations are made in the future, no matter how unwanted they are in the eyes of fans. I'm looking at you, Snow White and Percy Jackson. Now, Nosferatu is not only in the public domain, it is a well-acclaimed movie that everyone can enjoy from the comfort of their homes. As Robert Ebert has stated, Munro's Nosferatu ended up inspiring so many Dracula retellings, and yet somehow the most non-Dracula of them all ended up leaving the biggest mark. And since we're on the topic of remakes, let's talk about Robert Eggers' remake of Nosferatu. Eggers has been passionate about Nosferatu for the longest time, so understandably, he was hyped about bringing his version of the story to us. And now that I've seen it, I can tell this is an unflinching and grim film. It's grotesque and yet so beautiful. You would be repulsed and hypnotized at the same time. Bill Skarsgård as Count Orlok is beyond whatever I had expected. I've seen him as Pennywise, but the way Eggers managed to push Skarsgård's limits and turn him into this chilling monster with a devilish appetite is just fascinating. Nicholas Hoult and Lily Rose Depp are as amazing as the Hutter couple, and their acting chops really show. The atmosphere of the movie is just wintry enough that you feel the dread and the death that is there now that Orlok is here, and I love it. Marvelous verdict. Vampires have been a rather fascinating breed of supernatural creatures. The inherent eroticism of the darkest desires, the temptation to be corrupted and join in a senseless bloodbath, is a part of the appeal of a vampire. Or so it would seem if you look around you and consume modern-day depictions of vampires. In the whole century of vampires appearing on screen, Nosferatu has left a mark in our hearts that no one has ever been able to replace, and I doubt they ever will be. I hope that Munro is happy knowing his work is so well loved and cherished by fans all over the world, when he spent the majority of his last years watching his masterpiece being destroyed. With that, guys, we come to the end of our video. Let us know in the comments what you guys think about Nosferatu, both the 1992 and the 2024 versions, and who you like the most between Count Orlok and Count Dracula as a villainous vampire. Until next time, bye! If you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.